Mon nom s'affiche comme tout à l'heure, mais tout à l'heure, c'était pas moi.
You have got my name here. That's the right name. After it's done to practice, I'm going to chair this session. We are going to listen to Mr. Lerich, CEO of GetLink, Philippe Ducam, who will be speaking from Paris, who is a CEO for Europe with the ExxonMobil, Lucille Schmidt, who came by train and who is chairing the ecologic factory, let's say, and Mr. Kramp from TSE, Toulouse School of Economics, the economic expert, and is going to open this session. What about the Paris goals? Can they be reached? That's the first and preliminary question. What about France's status on this score vis-a-vis the criticism we have already heard so far in the first session? Thanks very much for your introduction. Christian Grolier explained how difficult it was to define a common good. And in this session, for this session, I'm going to suggest my personal solution. Common good in this session will mean and will be has to be understood as troposphere. What is troposphere? Troposphere is the atmosphere layer in which you find 80% of the gases, and this troposphere in which we do live and which keeps us alive is 12 kilometers high. If you want to know more about this troposphere, do envisage a football ball, and troposphere would measure 0.2 millimeter at the surface of this ball. During thousands and thousands of years, our ancestors have been living by kind of grasping and taking up some of the resources at the surface, and our activity consists in looking into the ball, things which are going to be spread out around the surface of the ball, saturating the surface, of course, consequently, and entailing highly negative impacts and effects. That's why we have to introduce dedicated measures in order to avoid major havoc. All our activities do reject carbon dioxide, various gases accumulating in the atmosphere and triggering the climate change. What matters most is not the emission itself, but what is stored in the atmosphere. The more you increase the stock, the worse it becomes, except if you find the appropriate measures to kind and decrease the stock. And in fact, we should stop things. We should stop storing and take up what is in the atmosphere and store it either underground or develop huge amounts of positive species, tree species, for instance, in order to take up CO2. We are running a real rat race at the moment. Rat race, not really, actually. I would say we should be working and playing in a team. Of course, we do need very good musicians, but not only. If we are good musicians and if there are poor musicians elsewhere, you're going to have a very poor orchestra. So that means that everybody and each of us has to do their best. 3 slides, if I may, to illustrate what I wanted to say. Well, that's not my slides, actually, Mr. Kramp is saying. So if we just stick to what I have said so far, Well, you had a fantastic map of Europe illustrating the status of each country, and France wasn't that bad actually, but this map was very valuable. Well, the map was illustrating emissions, but in energy sector. If we look at electricity only, we're doing well. Why? Because of the nuclear power stations, 30 grams emission per kilowatt per hour. Nordic countries with a lot of hydric power are not doing too bad. The worst of the worst, the Germans and Poland, which do use a lot of coal, of course, to produce electricity. But let's not forget the impact effects of transport, farming, etc. etc. So electricity and electrification, major breakthrough in the 20th century. Hasn't done differently. And Neil Armstrong had electrification rank first among major achievements and breakthrough in the 20th century. Let's look at this map. I would like to have it on screen, actually. So in order to head for greater improvement in terms of performances, we should multiply by 3 electricity power production at world scale. Why? Why? Just because it has it needs an enhanced use, not only to heat houses, but also it has to be used in transport, in industry, etc. It has to be used more and more when it's already used, and to be introduced when it's not used. And this has to be done, of course, in a clean manner. So the point is to multiply production by 3, hence huge investments needed, and then we must head for a power mix. Here is my map, and this map encapsulates the CO2 emissions per kilowatt per hour, and this is expressed in grams. And you can see that we are doing very well as compared with other European countries. So we have really to change altogether in terms of energy, doing away with fossil fuels. Zero emissions. This should be the result around 2050. And the project is the lower bar. And what is shown left on this graph is what is meant to disappear. And in the lower part of this bar chart, you must you can notice that solar power has gained a lot of momentum. Yet, let me tell you that this target is not an easy one. So, if we look at the intermediate bar, you'll see the governmental recommendations, the government's recommendations. And on the second bar, starting from the top, you have the various political measures.
So thank you. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I just wanted to see Mr. Ricom in video. Our next speaker should appear in video, but I don't see him. But we do hear his voice. So pending the image, maybe let me ask you a question. You are an industry that is very decarbonated. So most of your activities are electrical. So how is the train really, really good for the planet compared to other modes of transportation? And you're going to give us figures. We know that you are, when you are really decarbonated, what are the other routes in order for your activities to be even greener? And tell us about your commitments as well, because you have always been a very committed company and you're active in this research. Why is the train green? For two reasons. The first one, because it is fueled by electricity, and also because energy-wise, it consumes 6 times less than a car a truck that drives on the road, because the contact between roads and metal is much more efficient than trucks on roads. We are green, but we do not stop there. When you think about the electric shuttles that crisscross Europe with activities with Getlink, of course, we're not at the end of the story, because we are moving even further. We are in stock exchange company, and we have financial targets. So we need to generate profit and generate money in order to keep living and being able to pay salaries for our employees and pay taxes and all of that. And at the same time, we also have to play our part in terms of climate commitments. So we know that we have to go on this route of decarbonation. So what we do is that we give ourselves the good instruments, because today it is a mature topic. We have good metrics that show that we know what we're doing. But just moving on to this specific question, I would like you to tell us in concrete terms what you do, because you still have diesel locomotives, you still have buildings that are not insulated. What are your priority actions in order to gain in terms of energy performance for Getlink? We do measure. Yes, that is the last chapter, and we're going to give a bit of time to that. We are continuing the research on technologies that are the greenest possible to promote sustainable solutions or less sustainable solutions. One example, among others, is the railway network in France. Having in Catenary, we still have diesel trains for our traffic, and that needs to be improved. We have an innovative partnership where we recover colza oil to fuel, but it is not a very sustainable solution. But meanwhile, for the next 5-10 years, we are reducing the amount of pollution. So I can see you. Hi, thank you for coming. So Technip worked, and you did actually create a new subsidiary, which is called Low Carbon Solutions. I wanted to know what was your driver, what is your target, and what does the new entity do within Exxon? First of all, hello, and I hope you hear me. I am so happy to be with you this time digitally. It's part of the changes of behavior that we have to do. It's not always possible to take the train, so today I'm with you, but virtually. And a company like ExxonMobil, a company which is heavy on oil, going green because we have a social role. We have a role in order for the society and the company to still take advantage of all of this, but move forward. For us, the strategy is clear and easy. It has 4 pillars: reduce our own emissions, help our customers and partners reduce their own emissions, and we're going to speak about that, do R&D, because there's still a lot to do in technological terms to reduce emissions. and participate in debates, participate in the setting up of new policies so that we can achieve those new technologies that will later on be deployed. There's a lot of theory, but there's also real action, concrete actions. We've already reached our targets for 2025. For 2030, we have explained the reduction of 70% by 70% of our methane emissions, the reduction of CO2 emissions as well. So in the window of 2016-2030, net zero. So we have another target for 2050, not just a target, but roadmaps already for each of our plants to help us achieve that. And as you mentioned, the creation of this new entity, Low Carbon Solution, which is which comes as an addition to our oil and gas and our refinery activities, lubrication activities. And its mission is to deploy the solutions. We have $17 billion that have been put into that, and we wish to invest by 2027 into low carbon solution. In practical terms, focuses on three main technologies: the catchment and carbon sequestration, carbon trapping before it goes into the atmosphere, trying to catch it and keep it in the biofuels, as was mentioned before, and hydrogen, which can play a role, which in the future will play a role in various applications, such as in transportation, for instance. So for us, these are really specific technologies with the ambition of being a leader in those areas. So I think we can discuss further of what it means and what we do in practical terms. So after this first roundtable, let me turn to you. You are observing ecology. What do you think of these various approaches where each industry is trying to find solutions? So this all happens in the framework of a big picture for the planet. Is this a solution? Are the companies with the means that they have in the best position to make things, to improve things? As we said in the first part of the discussions, the role of companies and the solutions they propose. Thank you very much, Guylaine. I understood that my role was to be the contrarian because I listened to your speeches. I'm not going to tell you that, wow, everything is beautiful and we know how to sequester, to trap carbon. One thing is striking, as was said earlier, there are activists outside hung to the walls. There were activists last year, so it is becoming a habit in the Summit of Common Good. So my opinion is that the question is not just the question of the common good, it's the question of common language, what we do in terms of ecological transition. The question is, will we speak the same language one day between activists, economists who are more liberal economists, and business leaders for this common project of changing society and talking about this project, a democracy project. So the question of common good should seek a common language, and this is not something that is so self-evident. I wanted to say a few things about the language of economy because I think that I am the only person that was at some point in among the green, because this was a green party. Economy used to be the enemy. Companies used to be the enemy. I was always in a position, and I'm still are, of the position of we need to discuss. I remember one of our summer days or summer symposium where I proposed inviting some company leaders, and the answer was no. And if they come, we're going to throw tomatoes to their face. So I think that the important thing, the challenge here is, as a contrarian, to organize this essential notion of credibility. I'm here. I'm not here as a traitor, but that is going to be attached to my image today. But this question of the discourse and debates and how we discuss the green stakes is something we do need to discuss, and we'll come back to that later on. The other question that was raised by you, sir, the difficulty is that each one says, I have my targets and trying to reach them, and we're moving towards achieving that target. And on the other hand, you can see that the challenge of transformation of the model is somehow not embraced by the company itself, because as we said earlier, maybe the companies do not have to embrace the transformation of the model, but namely in the question of fossil energies. We talked about stranded assets with the topic of when is the deadline, or when are the activities of those companies become or lose their status of assets or become less profitable. How do we organize the transformation of the trade, the specialty, or stop it? And this is what the activists climbing our walls today are asking or demanding. And when you read the report by Pisani-Ferry, you can talk about deep transformation, not necessarily renunciation, but reindustrialize with green reindustrialization. But how that implies renunciations or innovations? How can we comply with the Paris Agreement? We are far from being compliant. So the state today is facing climate complaints that it is losing in the courts. So the debate is Orwellian. The French state is condemned because not compliant with the Paris agreements. And you have shown that companies, depending on the sectors in which they are active, are saying we're doing better, but the Paris agreements shall not be complied with. So let's go back to concrete terms. As you said on the phone, we cannot produce in the same way, and some companies shall not produce the same way as before. The efforts made by Total, Exxon, or Getlink. So it is important compared to what even the citizens do. Well, I don't know. I'm speechless on that, because we spoke a lot about metrics in the first exchanges. The question of measuring, assessing, and see how behaviors are going to change in the next 10 years. Are we going to have exponential transformation? But the emission of carbons by these companies is something that is assessed, measured. But the question is actually, what do we offer? It's in market terms. Do we offer the citizens the choice of changing? It's all the yellow jacket problems, Can we swap something else to cars? In the Spinetta report, there was a plan to close all the small train lines. We are in Occitanie region, where the rail is a very, very big challenge. So the whole thing is actually highlighting the failure to anticipate on the part of governments. So each of us, we are in a network of demands, especially when we have a lower income. But I think we can say that everybody has to play a role, but I am not sure that really the ball is in the hands of citizens. How do we consider temporality, our role towards future generations? We spoke about giving the means to citizens of changing their behaviors, and this is a topic that we spoke about together. You said we're not doing enough marketing in favor of the new solutions. We should not just talk about the constraints. We also need to drive the desire in people to use better and cleaner means, better for the climate. So when we talk about the client, we talk about physics, the number of tons of CO2 emitted, So that's the first part. And then we talk economics, carbon tax, and redistribution mechanisms, etc. But we never talk about the desirability of tomorrow's decarbonated world. If we forget the fact that the new solutions that we're considering, even if they are green solutions, these solutions might be rejected by everybody, by citizens or by companies. And if that happens, we won't reach our goals. If we do not make the train, for instance, a means of transportation from Paris to Lyon or from Toulouse to London that is attractive to travelers, it would be decarbonated, but if people are not interested, it won't work. And going back to marketing, the topic of climate, we're not just rational beings because you are a human, we're also emotional. And if we don't address all of that, we'll fail. So you can start asking questions and then we can answer. Just a question on these metrics that really disturb the company leaders. And you explained very clearly that if you're doing what the activists are doing, want to reduce your production of gas, you'd have better scores. Because, of course, you'd produce less CO2. But the gas that you not produce, that should have gone in India, would have been translated in coal consumption. How do you see things, and how should we change things, change these standards in order for that to not just be concentrated on the activity of the company, but on the activity of the planet?
Well, thank you for the question. When we think about what has been said about the carbon tax, if you talk about the offer and demand and supply, and so what is quite clear is that the products, energy, oil, gas, that are consumed, this is an essential part, and we're looking for alternatives. How can we make sure that the carbon price and the emission price should be reflected in the purchasing price of the customer? This is the carbon tax and the carbon price, which will enable the new solutions to be competitive relative to the current solutions. And so the solutions be they to capture carbon at the plant where it is produced, or should it be? Should we use hydrogen? No, this is all more expensive. There's a cost, and it could be 1, 2, 3, 4 times more expensive relative to traditional solutions. We are looking at the technologies. That's what we are doing. But there's also the social, economic, regulatory aspect. How can we make sure that the carbon price should enable us to direct demand towards the low carbon products? So we have been clearly and explicitly the supporters of the carbon tax as a concept. But then we don't want to ration what we are producing today in order to help people. What we are going to do, we're going to increase significantly the price of traditional solutions without reducing the price for the alternative solutions. So I think there are economists and sociologists that can explain this better than I do. But how can we implement some carbon solutions at a low cost? This has to be done with politicians, with the governments, to make sure that it is economically wise. And so if you look at the trapping of carbon, we're working on this, and we have announced 2 practical projects in the States, which were developed last year, which will be implemented in 2025. We have a regulatory framework and our environment enabling us to work with producers, those who are going to transport carbon, and store it in order to reduce the solutions. And so this is one step, 2026. This is one part of our knowledge and know-how. This is what we are trying to put forward. There's this question of, do we have a common dialogue? If something is sure, is that the carbon neutrality is a necessity. This is something that we all share. And how can we manage to reach this particular goal? Well, you have to create this environment between the technologies, between the regulatory framework and the infrastructures to develop these solutions so that we can invest, and so that with the scale, economies of scales, we can do this at a greater level. Well, looking at, we talked about this before. We looked at the carbon tax price. It's not very easy for the companies because the price of this tax is going to evolve through time. And if you are making an investment, it has to be done at 40, 50 or 60 years. This is the lifetime of your locomotive or trains. So you said there was a need for a regulatory framework. So we have that for the currencies, but you also talked about inventing with the economist some decarbonized margin or metric. Could you possibly explain that and about this carbon tax and the new metrics that has been thought up with TSE? Well, yes, in my introductions, we have a double imperative, as I said. We have an economic and financial imperative. We need systems and we need, there are taxes that are paid for the welfare of our countries, and also we have a climate need. So there we have some metrics that are good on the financial side, and this is only the start regarding the measurement of the climate and more generally the whole energy problematic. And then we are all lost because some are proposing new metrics at the European Commissions there, and we also have measured something like more than 1,100 possible metrics. So I do not know how to do with this. And I would like people to explain to me how we're going to do that, because it's red tape, really. And then we have to measure the finance on one side, and on the other side, you have to look at the extra financial aspects as if these were two different worlds, but we have one company with one strategy, and so there's a need to have both in the same basket. So we created within a framework of our chair with the TSE school an indicator which is making the missing link between the finance and climate. By computing our decarbonized margin, we take our margin, which is the cash flow, our revenue less the cost. This is the conventional side, and then we subtract or we add a virtual point, which is a bill, which is the carbon bill, which we'll be paying tomorrow when it is implemented with the European policies to enact this who pollutes, who pays. So by comparing this with our conventional method, we can see whether we can pay this. Now, many companies are not able to pay this carbon margin tomorrow because it's a matter of survival. This is the survival philosophy for our companies. We are very lucky because we are very much green, so we can go ahead. We have some investing possibilities, and we have also we are a green company, so we should really roll out our solutions, and we have to do that. That's the first point. Now, in order to do this, we have to compute our emissions, and we have to value them, and this is where it's difficult because we looked at the recommendations by Christian Gaulier, and we looked at the most recent work from the Environment Agency in the US, looking at the carbon tax at 187 euros, and this is the most recent work. Still, when you make an investment in our trades, like iron, if you purchase a locomotive for 50 years, particularly for freight, do we buy this machine as a diesel powered in order to go on all the non-electrified network, or should we buy a machine based on hydrogen? That would be better. But then hydrogen is not mature; it's just being started for the passenger trains, light trains. But we are looking at heavy trains, and it's an industrial risk. So it's very difficult to do that. We could reflect if you had an idea of the cost of carbon tomorrow. But then, as of now, Europe is implementing this who pollutes, who pays principle, which is very good. There's the ETS market. I'm not going into details, but of course I have no visibility on the evolution of the cost of carbon. And then it's not very complicated if Europe has decided to have 50-55. We have an ambition with this, and we are able to compute a trajectory, or at least a corridor of the evolution of carbon, to make some economic computations that are valid, because money is scarce if it's private or public, and then we need to have a performance sense rationale, because we have to invest where it's going to be efficient and profitable. And despite all the efforts made by ourselves, we want the power that be work with us, and so that we have an horizon which is sufficiently long, so that we make pertinent computations and make the right decisions to decarbonize. So we make so we need this metric, but we also need visibility. This is what we are looking for in order to know about the cost of carbon tomorrow. Right. One question which is asked now by the public: what is the right metric in order to implement and to look at the efforts made by the communities and the companies in favor of reducing CO2? What is the right metric? I think that decarbonation has been invested as a metric. In other words, the neutrality in 2050 is also something which is supported by the various companies and which has been supported by Scope 1 and 2. Is that the right metric? Could you say a few words about Scope? Yes, I think you can do that better than me then. 1 and 2, Scope 1 and 2, this is what the companies are producing, and the third is what the customers are producing. So at Exxon, it's very badly scored because because of the drivers are purchasing that gasoline. So should we act on the citizens rather than the companies, because they are penalized, because they are... What is clear is that Scope 3 is such that all the General Assemblies are disturbed by activists. In other words, today the expectations of part of the... I don't know what should I say, the whole society, but at least one part of the youth, which is a powerful part on ecology, or the active minority, which has been theorized by Moscovici, has always been essential. But then the idea is that we should aim at the majority, because there's a link between ecology and democracy which has to be made. But then all the General Assemblies, that they should all be disturbed by Scope 3, makes us think about who's running the companies. And this is an important point, because even for the shareholders, this is a topic which is progressing. So you were saying that you have implemented this structure, this subsidiary to trap carbon. This is due as well to the arrival of new directors. There's a governance evolution within the companies, which is very important as well. Now, right, yes, there's a convergence here. Yes, there's an awareness, and we can see that it's not only on the part of the activists, because now we're talking about the fake activists. That's quite funny, because I used to talk about that, but these could also be some funds looking for more profitability. But then these fake activists have funds that are looking for more transition, more ecology. So this is a topic which is interfering. There's an interaction between society and the company governance, and that's all for the good. But then it is raising a number of issues, like what about the responsibility of the power that be, and what about the scale? Because you talked about the states, and I think that with the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm sure that there are measures that are quite encouraging. But then Europe decided, Europe is not the states first; it's a coalition of companies, or a coalition of states. And relative to what you were saying about the ambition level for 50-55 to 2030, now the implementation of 50-55 is based on the state's motives, and how can this be done in practice? Maybe in the States things are done more practically than here, but we have this situation which is more difficult on the energy level here, because we have chosen to associate with this, and we are looking at the norm, and we have to evolve in terms of rules. There should be more state. There should be a European policy. It's quite interesting if you are a public actor at the European level, but for the companies it may be difficult in terms of link between the theory of the directive and the practice, in terms of subsidies, in terms of funding, and also in terms of competitiveness on a general level, on a whole level. Because then also I'd like to say something else about India, about coal and carbon and gas. There's a constant narrative on the part of the fossil fuel producers. They say that they have to feed the southern countries, that's for sure, but this implies, as has been said during the last scope, you should have some coalitions in order to fund this transition in the southern countries. But then you cannot reason only on the French village or on the adaptation of the emissions Well, this is the ideal situation. Well, the ideal you have to adapt. We live in Occitania here, and it's not because you're going to reduce the energy this is not the ideal. No, we have to adapt to the local situation. Well, regarding democracy, this is a question asked by the public. What about Exxon? What do they do in order to meet the expectations of companies, of society? This is how should I say, it's an abstract question, but are you talking with the activists and the environmentalists looking for solutions in order to reduce Scope 3 and also to urge drivers on this particular topic? Are you making research, doing research? Well, these are topics that are very important for us. And we are committed with a very large panel of stakeholders, as we say in English, and there's a large demand on the part of the company as a whole. We want to supply energy to society, and if we've learned something from the Ukraine war, we should. It's very important to have. The role is going to evolve through time. We are working, as has been rightly said, we are looking at zero carbon. But then afterwards, there are 500 scenarios that exist throughout the GIEC, or also by looking at the European Energy Agency, in order to meet the demands of the Paris Accords. And so there we should be able to meet the demands of society in all these scenarios. And how can we do that? Well, we have a portfolio of investments and opportunities that enable us to invest more in the low carbon as the solution becomes more viable and responds to the society's expectations, and also looking at traditional solutions. So we have invested $70 billion and for ourselves and our customers. And something else which has been done, which has been well said as well, is that it's a partnership. The private sector cannot do anything without the public sector, without the governments, and a lot of things will be done thanks to regulatory frameworks that will enable us to invest. And in Europe at the moment, I think this has been mentioned as well. And I can also emphasize this more specifically, as I can see with the company I work with, and Europe has got a deficit in terms of skills for the industry, and this deficit has only been increasing with the Ukraine war. So we are expecting to do significant investments to reduce the emissions of these infrastructures and equipment. Now, the regulatory framework is added 14,000 pages of rules and regulations in Brussels over the last 3 to 4 years, and we are adding up the Mezzo Industry Act to meet the demands of the European proposals. And these are mandates, and there are objectives that have to be reached, but they are not well defined. We do not know exactly how to invest, how it's going to work, how it's going to be profitable for the investor. So the message here is to say that we are as a company, where will these 17 billion be earmarked? Will it be going to Europe or to the States? The Mezzo Industry Act, it's very simple, and it looks at all the technologies that could participate if they meet the criteria that have been defined. But then in Europe, to find a way to reach or to access a number of these supports for the technologies that are not competitive at the moment is quite complicated. It's more regulations, more prohibitions, and more things that are imposed onto us. And then, fortunately, in Europe, we have an awareness. We can see the last announcements that have been made by the government, looking at the reindustrialization and the importance of the industry. And there's an awareness which is indispensable, because in Europe, we have a deficit in terms of competitiveness and attractiveness in terms of these investments. At the end of the day, the monies will go where it contributes most to decarbonization. It's a world problem, and it's very important to continue working together, particularly with the legislator, in order to implement proposals that will be competing with what is done in the rest of the world.
Pour vous, là, Claude Cramp.
Another question to Mr. Cramp. Don't you think that in France we should do something in terms of imports when it comes, of course, to decarbonization? Well, you were saying that the carbon emissions were higher than per capita on the French territory. Problem remains the same. We have a worldwide problem. One carbon emitted in Singapore, Toulouse, or Los Angeles will act exactly in the same manner, will have the same impact, whatever the area, wherever maybe. And since we are not in a position to set a fixed price worldwide, the word carbon frightens everyone. And that's why we are kind and beating around the bush, funding solar arrays, funding aeolian farms, etc., etc. And we do forget that when you want to invest in a clean technology, most of it will have to be imported. That means it will have been produced with several means and equipment and facilities which may not be all that clean. And the emissions produced per capita on the national territory are lower than the imports of emissions per capita. But what does that mean? The Occitanie region was talking about the interest of having a clean area in the Occitanie region. But what does that mean? It means we will have to import means and facilities coming from elsewhere, but which will be highly carbon loaded, so to speak. And that's why we have to be very careful in this respect. So the fight against climate warming and change is something awkward with us. We do multiply regulatory measures, new restrictions, regulations. If we look at the 2020 regulatory measures, the decree has 1,800 pages. Who on earth can read this? And when we try to call on to collective intelligence in order to ask people to pay for emissions, well, we have the choice between several solutions. In France, we do opt for more regulatory measures. That's the point. Now, well, I ask my question and then I give you the floor. Have you got the feeling that Europe wants to really take steps forward in terms of regulations and goals? Does Europe have the appropriate means to reach its goals and targets and to be one of the forerunners in this matter? Or are we going to be kind of penalized? I lived in the States for a while, and you know that in the States things are different when it comes to climate. In Europe, we have collectively decided something, and what we are not able to do in Europe is a real moot point and a point for concern. We are very, very good in terms of theory, very poor when it comes to practice. And of course, we can use in the collective intelligence. We can innovate at central level. That's maybe positive. Now, when it comes to implementation, we have got plenty of regulatory tax measures, KPIs, etc. And we can only but realize that this transition is going to be extremely costly. And all in all, the bill, the invoice will be too high, or it won't be able to do it for lack of appropriate means, or because it will be rejected by the populations, by the people people, we do need the money to pay for health, etc. Climate is essential, is important, but if we are running going through major threats, running a real danger in a different field, everybody is going to review the climate problem, the climate issue in a different way. And I'm sure we are going to spend years and years in order to define the appropriate mechanism. Climate is actually a rather simple issue. We know how to measure CO2 emissions, for instance, but the problem is how to avoid excessive red tape and bureaucracy, and how to give sufficient leeway to the major stakeholders without ignoring the importance of research work, which is still being conducted, of course, in MATA, and pointing to future innovations, mandatory future innovations, which will have to be developed at the right pace in order to give the right momentum to the new trends. You would like to add one word?
No, very briefly, just to bounce back on the point, which I think is very important. When we don't build in Europe, we import the carbon in one way or another. When you look at this question from a different angle, the way you measure a product, so that everybody can understand what they're buying, it's the analysis of life cycles, and these are measures that are indispensable if we want to have import taxes on those emissions. These are measurements that we take so that a supplier can discuss with the customers, and the customer can make a decision on what they buy. Easily putting a carbon tax on products is something that will enable the measurement of the carbon emission. This is something that we spend a lot of time on trying to understand how it could work. It can be applied to all products that are marketed, and I think that it can be an alternative to all the discussions of COP3. Everybody understands, but your scope 1 is my scope 3. It is interesting to have that, but I think that have a proper measurement and then explaining to people what is a carbon virtuous product and which one is not, and enabling everybody to make enlightened choices seems to me really important. Bouncing back on something that Yann Lariche said, the visibility of the price of carbon would be something important for investors. Today, we have a multitude of prices for carbon in Europe, depending on subsidies, on sectors. The price of electric cars can be 400, 500 euros the ton. So each action taken leads to a price of carbon, which is not necessarily an optimization for society. Thank you. So I had one question also from the floor. Are you optimistic on our capacity to abide by the Paris agreements? And do you think Europe, and you've heard everything that everybody here said, too many standards, too many regulations, too much opacity, too many instruments that are so different, too much diversity in instruments? Is this something, is this something that speaks of something that is emerging, or is the process too administrative, not incitative enough? Thank you, Guylaine. On the Paris agreements, I think that the important thing is that it is important to remind that it is a universal agreement signed by most United Nations states. It was an agreement that was reached because there was a lot of contribution by each state, and each state is then responsible for the implementation. So we set a goal, and each state does what they want. Being optimistic, I don't know if it's the term that we should have. We have no choice. If we want to keep being a society, and in a democracy like ours, give a future to the next generations is something essential. It's part of the democratic pact. The compact requires us to abide by this. Simply, I think we need to see an evolution of social roles. We were speaking about the fact that the role of the company is to do this and to do that, and the citizen should do this, should do that. I think that we all should reconsider what we need to do compared to what we thought 20 years ago. I think that you, as CEO of ExxonMobil, you have changed as you went, and I have changed along the years. I'm not happy with just motos, and I think that it's not a diplomatic agreement. It is an agreement that is really different from all international treaties, because it is at the level of each scale, and it does activate compacts between companies, citizens, and local authorities. This was said earlier by way of introduction, but this notion of really seeing what the energy transition is, or ecology transition, if we are active on that, it is because they are local authorities have an action at a certain level. So talking about the train in Occitanie, all of this is essential. So you have this notion of playing along these different scales. How are we going to keep the game going on the different rungs of that ladder or the scale? But I think that the Paris Agreement remains the reference point, and we have to achieve it involves playing, a ping-ponging between the different players or parties involved. What we would want the best for yourself and for your loved ones, and that has to be played against your personal ethics. So ExxonMobil, you have always been seen as the big bad wolf, and you hid things. So I'm just saying this. So it's not the topic. That's off the subject. The topic is not that you were the big bad wolf in 1980. The topic is, how are you changing today? And also on a personal term, you have to relate between the collective and the personal. So we need to refocus on Europe. Europe is a power of standardization, but the question is, how do you apply standards? It's not just companies that have to lead the way and show the way into that. So we had Emmanuel Macron's intervention. It is good because things that happen at the level of Europe is good because it will extend. Ursula von der Leyen, it is important what she did with the Green Deal. It is important to see how the road is mapped by people. But then you have laws, regulations that have to be used in a simple way so that we can walk along the way, and with everybody knowing what they can do within the framework of the law. So time really flies, and we need to conclude with you, Claude. You have a topic on the table, which is the number of people who live without electricity, the number of people who each year access electricity, with the impact that has on the planet, and the number of 2.6 billion people who have no access to means that are non-polluting. And this reaches the problematic posed by Lucille. Could you please give us a round picture of what we have to expect? So we are talking a lot about us, people in the Northern Hemisphere, but we have to remember that a lot of people on this planet do not have electricity. It would be unimaginable for us to live without electricity, whereas there is almost 1 billion people without electricity on Earth. Since the 2010s, we witnessed an increase in the rate of electrification. It's a good side, but there's always a dark side to that kind of metric. This increase in the number of people who now can access electricity, we find it in Asia. Almost nothing in Africa. Almost nothing happened in Africa. But in Asia, we know that in Asia, electricity is produced with coal-fired, mostly coal-fired plants. So I think about 300 million people, individuals who have access to electricity and who didn't before. And you know that electricity is made with non-decarbonated means. So for those inhabitants of Asia, it's not good. But further, it's not good for the planet. The massive electrification toward which we're going, which is a problem that we cannot address here. Electricity cannot be stored. You cannot have an inventory of energy, which is why we have a major challenge, except for you, because you get it across a line, an overhead line, when trains can use it all along that line. So we have lost the battle in the course of the 20th century to the benefit of oil products. So we're trying to solve that now, electrification and hydrogen research and all of that. But there's still a lot ahead of us. So thank you. And well, we're closing on that dark note, or rather dark note. Thank you all for participating in the reflection. And in a few minutes now, we're going to talk about mobility, which is another big topic for the planet. Thank you.